Hey friends, how do you know that your app will be supportable in production unless you're using logs in development and QA? Try Seek for centralized logging that you can host yourself anywhere, including on your development machine. Go to datalust.co/SEQ to learn more. That's datalust.co/SEQ. Seek. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Dr. Simón Sun. They're a scientist, musician, and an artist in the R.W. Tsien Lab at the NYU Neuroscience Institute. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Thanks for chatting with me today. You know, sometimes I get the blessing to talk to really interesting people on the show, and sometimes they have an interest, and they have one interest, and that's the thing that they do, and they're deeply interested in it. And then sometimes I get to talk to multi-hyphenates. And the thing that I think kind of captured a lot of people's imagination about the work that you're doing is you have a very deep interest in the brain, but then music popped out of that. And I think that that's unexpected. I think we assume scientists to be in a little narrow, like, this is the thing that I do. But you're unapologetically a multi-hyphenate. You have many interests.
Yeah, I consider it like a big part of my story in terms of my interest in both science and art. I tell the story of like when I was upbringing. So I'm a trans woman, and early on in my life, it was difficult given where I grew up, trying to understand like certain aspects of myself, and I found that science and art were these two ways for me to like ask questions and express myself. And so like as I've gone through life and chosen a career path and all of that, yeah, I can't have one without the other. And I find that sometimes it really helps in sort of reframing what I'm doing in one thing. So like a big music project that I've been working on is informed by my science and the process of acquiring data, that kind of thing. So yeah,
it's interesting. It's kind of a metaphor for the days that we live in, that everyone wants everything to be binary. Like, oh, you're a nerd,
right.
And oh, you're a fan, and like, oh, it's Marvel or it's DC. It's not both. But
yeah,
everything is a spectrum, right? And we want people to have one interest so that we can put them in a little box. And when we meet multidimensional, multi-hyphenate people, we're like, oh, this is a unique unicorn who likes two things. You're not allowed to like two things.
Yeah, I know, right? We can do more than one thing.
Isn't that funny how surprised we are in 2021 that people can do more than one thing at a time? But you're interested in the brain, and you're a scientist who's focusing on the brain, specifically in homeostatic plasticity of neurons. That's pretty darn specific. If you're at a dinner party and you're like, yeah, I study the brain, but you're studying very specific aspects of the tissue, right?
Right. So as you said, I study homeostatic plasticity, which is this ability for neurons to regulate their synaptic strengths or their connections. Sometimes the brain is a very interesting organ, right? Like it's this thing that happens to span so many different scales, of like inquiry. We can look at the brain from a genetic level. We can look at the brain from like a circuit level of how the neurons are connected, all the way up to, like the full-blown organism, and, how the brain processes information and manages to, help us interact with the world around us. And so that was one of the things that really drew me toward the brain. And homeostatic plasticity is this very specific aspect that looks at how neurons are able to change, right? We think that the plasticity is the ability, or maybe the biological substrate for things like learning and memory, our ability to adapt and change our behavior in response to alterations in, our experiences. And homeostatic plasticity is sort of almost counterintuitive in terms of what homeostasis means, right? Like homeostasis is this idea that you need to keep the system within this boundary, because you don't want it to leave the boundary, and leaving the boundaries or the range of sort of like the range of that leads to, like bad things, that kind of thing. And so like we need that stability. And so this idea that, homeostatic plasticity, where neurons are using change to keep themselves stable, is particularly interesting aspect I find of studying the brain.
Mm-hmm. So we're doing this podcast, and I'm watching a waveform of your speech. And the tool that we're using is called Zencaster, and it's an online tool. And as you speak, it's adjusting the amplitude of the speech and presumably avoiding us to have be too low or to blow the microphone out
Right.
too high. And if it wasn't moving, that would be hard, right? You need
Yeah.
time in order for it to make those decisions. Is that an example of some kind of homeostasis within the context of this audio?
Yeah, so I really enjoy using musical metaphors, since I do dabble in music, and homeostatic plasticity actually we think classically that it opposes this other form of plasticity that happens, known as Hebbian plasticity. And that's more of like the positive feedback loop. So like when you take a microphone and you put it too close to the speaker, like the amplification process just happens so quickly, and then all of a sudden you lose all the information. And that was actually one of the original questions that came up when scientists were studying studying plasticity, because they discovered Hebbian plasticity, the ability for neurons to increase the strength of their synapses when they were firing more. So like there's this classic idea that neurons fired together, wired together. And, if that's the only way that neurons can change, well, that's a positive feedback loop. And you're going to lose all the information that you gained from increasing that neural connection if you don't have something else that sort of keeps everything, returns everything back to this nice livable range.
Doesn't the body sometimes go out of control? There's not just thinking about the brain, but also like I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I use an open source artificial pancreas, and there's a feedback loop that we use to modify the insulin and the sugar that goes throughout our body. But I also, as a diabetic, I deal with inflammatory processes, whether it be a rash or some, asthma or, what's it called? Those are, they call them the itis, right? If you get a rash, it's called atopic dermatitis, which is like Latin for you got a rash. And it's a thing where it is a positive feedback loop. Like you could take perfectly good skin, scratch it really hard, and it turns red, and now you've got a rash, and you'll have it for weeks because the body's like, oh, we're doing this? Is that what we're doing? We're getting a rash right now. So you're saying that can happen in the brain? So something that can go wrong can fly off the handle in a bad way?
Yeah. So, there's a hypothesis that things like epilepsy are this example of plasticity gone awry, or the inability for the brain to properly compensate for itself. And so, it's still an unanswered question exactly how things like homeostatic plasticity might play into conditions like epilepsy. But yeah, it's sort of a similar idea where, and like the original idea of homeostasis was coined by a physiologist, and he used it to describe just sort of like what he was observing in many biological systems, that they had a tendency to try and return to like a set point, or like a place where they were most comfortable. And so your example of the regulation of insulin, like our entire our kidneys are organs that are built specifically to keep our internal ionic concentrations, like the ions in our body and our blood, within a certain range. So it just seems like I might be studying homeostasis at this like very specific neural level, but it's a phenomenon that appears all across like the spectrum of life. And it's kind of interesting to think about in terms of like, our current times. We're stuck we're currently within a growing pandemic, and, like viral replication is a form of like this positive feedback where you produce more virus. That virus then tries to find more cells to replicate itself in, and so on and so forth.
It does feel like someone needs to just take the microphone away from the speaker on the pandemic and just if you just pull it away just a little bit, just let it chill, because that's what the body needs, whether it be an epileptic person or whether diabetic. I always feel like if my body would just give me a week to chill, just pull the microphone away from the speaker, then I would find my own homeostasis again.
Right. Yeah, like sleep. I actually have several colleagues who study sleep, and it's funny to think about sleep as a homeostatic mechanism, right? Like a way for the brain to recover and consolidate the things that it's learned during the day. But sleep itself also has this homeostatic component where if you don't sleep, the sleep drive grows and grows and grows. So there's like that kind of like feedback as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's yeah, this is like one of the biggest questions I think that I find most interesting when it comes to studying biology is, we see this general phenomenon that exists. So how does it exist in particular living systems, and also how do they interact? Because of a very important question, because like these systems don't exist in isolation, obviously. So how they interact and how one can change the other is very important to understand. Yeah.
At your level of deep understanding of what's going on inside the brain, is there still a big gap between like I can visualize something, we're having a conversation right now, and you have these building blocks like little neurons and synapses that are firing? Because I'm just not seeing the gap. There's this uncanny valley that just happens where it's like you've got some molecules and you put them in a certain configuration, and now you got Scott, and now you got
Right.
Dr. Simone.
Yeah.
Do you know something we don't? Do you understand what's going on in there? Or are you still just poking electricity at things and watching them jiggle?
Yeah, I think it feels like we're still kind of at the stage of poking things and watching them jiggle, or like putting things in scanners and watching them change colors. There's the brain is a very difficult question to solve. Just like as I said earlier, the like sheer amount of different scales that the brain exists at, I think, makes the question harder to even approach.
Mm-hmm.
And so, neuroscience has this. It's really funny because like neuroscience has like so many subfields within it. Like you come in as a young graduate student, you're like, oh, I want to study the brain. I want to learn how my body, like how I think, how I can see, and all of that. And, like all these interesting questions. And then it's like you start learning about like, well, how do I even answer the question of like how do we see? Like do I start at the eye circuits, that where the neurons that go from the retina to the part of the brain that processes visual input, or do I study just the visual input area of the brain? And then you can dive even deeper where it's like, okay, so we know that this brain is specific, this area or these sets of neurons are important for processing like light moving in a particular direction. And then so like how does that information get encoded by presumably neural activity? I might know a lot about synaptic activity and how the molecules neurons use to change synapses, but how that translates to memory or learning is it involves that, but it's also just a pretty big gap, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And slow and steady is how we're going to get there, I think. Just finding out new things, like seeing new details, and coming up with these new frameworks that help us answer these kinds of questions, I think. So.
Mm-hmm. So this may be an ignorant question, as are most of my questions, but I'm curious: are we the neurons, or are we the electricity that jumps between them? Do we live in the spaces, or are we the thing?
Oh, that's quite the philosophical question. I think my approach actually to that question has been more. I think we are the connection between our body and the brain. There's the interesting sort of like the old philosophical like posit of like, if we put a brain in a vat and we give it everything that it needs, is it still the person that brain came from? And I think from what we're learning about how the brain interacts with other bodily systems, like the hormone system, and as a trans woman who's undergone transition, this has been a very salient part of my life experience. That it's become pretty clear to me, at least, that my existence is this combination, like you said, like the in-between space. It's not the electricity, but it's how that electricity or those neural signals interact with other aspects that is able to create, or allow for, I guess, an individual to exist on top of. So, that would be my answer to the question, but I'm sure there are plenty of other ones.
Yeah. I'm trying to understand, like, if, when we pass, the electricity is gone.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the cells stored, or were we the electricity that was turned off? Like that moment when you turn an incandescent bulb off and it drains a little bit, but there's still something there. And people who come back from being brain dead, that implies that there was always some, I don't know, static electricity that was available in order to maintain state. If you think about, like, I've got this hard drive on my desk here that I'm holding up, or a USB, there's no electricity keeping that in that in that stasis, but it eventually will fade away. We just don't really know when.
Right. Yeah, it's a combination, right? Like it's a combination of the, like the hardware and the software in a way, I personally don't like the analogy of like the brain as a computer too much, because it really limits the way we can think about the ability for it to change and that kind of thing. But, in this kind of conversation, it serves a pretty interesting purpose, right? Where if we think of the brain as a computer, then, when the computer is turned off, all the stuff is still there, but the software isn't running. You're not, like nothing is able to be done. So it's just, basically a box sitting on your desk. So, and that kind of gets back at the idea of, how I like to think of the brain as the, like our existence as this like in-between space, the interactions between the physical and like what the kind of things that come out of those physical properties, One aspect of homeostatic plasticity that I find really interesting actually is that, it's not just the synapses that change, but it's also the different kinds of ionic channels that neurons can have that leads to a change in an activity pattern, right? So if we're thinking about this idea of how, the spiking, the neural spikes and neural activity is a part of our, part of ourselves, this idea that we have of ourself or our ability to see, hear, think, that kind of thing, it exists on a material medium. Like the ion channels are what actually contributes to that change in activity. So, are we the ion channels? No. Or are we the spikes? Well, like kind of, right? So, you can't. It's always really hard to like really put a box around this kind of stuff, I think. Which in my mind, it makes it really interesting, right? Because then I'll always have a job. I'll always have some, it's like scientific question to try and disentangle. So
yeah, well, as with all things, truth and fact doesn't fit in a tweet, nor does it fit into a podcast.
Yeah, certainly not a tweet.
Getting things done is a challenge that everyone struggles with. One way to tackle it is to make sure that you have the right tools, and for your computer, that means the right apps. The problem is, not all apps do what they promise, and the drawn-out search for the right solution makes it harder to get the job done. That's why there's SetApp. SetApp is on a mission to help users get more done. With SetApp, there's no more worrying about having to search for apps to solve a problem. Instead, SetApp packs over 200 apps for your Mac and iPhone into one. There's an app for any task, so you can stay in your flow and finish what you started. With SetApp, you can think about your tasks, not your apps. A dedicated curation team only selects the highest quality apps, and new apps are added to SetApp regularly. Updates are free, and all the apps are full-featured pro versions. It's also a great value. Instead of paying thousands of dollars for separate licenses, there's just one flat monthly fee. Head over to setapp.com to try SetApp for a week. If you like SetApp, pay just $9.99 a month, as long as it's useful to you. And trust us, it will be. That's setapp.com, setapp.com. So homeostatic synaptic plasticity, am I fair to understand that it is the kind of the basis for learning and locomotion and how the body does stuff, and then Hebbian plasticity is more associated with memory, or is that a misunderstanding on my part?
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. So like, you know, that's actually been one of the big questions of the field is how does homeostatic and Hebbian plasticity work? So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, like Hebbian plasticity is the ability that, like I said, the fired and wired together. Like it's actually called Hebbian plasticity because the man who came up with that sort of sentiment, Donald Hebb, it's not just the ability for the neuron to change its synapse in response to new input. It's that it changes in response to that new input and then somehow can maintain that change. So one of the questions that has that homeostatic, like researchers who research homeostatic plasticity are thinking about is exactly how does homeostatic plasticity compensate for Hebbian plasticity? We've typically thought of these like forms of plasticity as opposing forces. Like we have the positive feedback and we have the negative feedback. But actually, one of the interesting parts of my research we've stumbled upon recently is that homeostatic plasticity actually uses parts of Hebbian plasticity to do its thing. So what does that overlap mean for the actions of homeostatic plasticity? It kind of like forces us to reconsider the framework that we had like imposed on the data and like our interpretation of it in the past. And that's actually, and like to get back at, how, science and like how I like to, I do science in music. One of the ways that I like to express this idea or almost like this feeling you get when you're doing this kind of study is, I take the electrical squiggles that I get from my neurons, and I impose a structure on them, right? Like, and in like data analysis, it's about like taking certain properties of those electrical squiggles, and like finding the statistical distributions within them, assigning sort of like some kind of quote value to ones that are like bigger squiggles versus little squiggles, and that for like a song, I can actually use the data, right? Like all of those little squiggles, and translate it into like a musical scale. Like I impose this sort of structure on it, and then we let the neuron do its thing, or we let the software, the code, the analysis to do its thing, and then we listen to the product. And it's interesting to think about that. That melody that comes out of the data doesn't actually exist. Kind of like the same way of like thinking about, are we sitting atop the neural activity, but rather it's being imposed by us as we're like by listening to it or by acquiring the data and doing this kind of analysis. So I really like that kind of dialogue that emerges from this kind of thing.
Interesting. So does the melody exist, or do we insist that it exists?
Right.
When we hear it?
Yeah, exactly.
We oppose upon it. We have many, many years of listening to music, so we have assigned. So when I heard some of the music, and we'll have links in the show notes, and you can go and look at all of this at simonsun.com. It sounded like the beginning of a really good video game. Like this could be the opening of Metroid. And I know that's because there's MIDI roots to it.
Yeah.
But that was what I imposed upon it. Well, when my wife listened to it, she felt like she was hearing classical music with a computer spin.
Oh, wow.
So she had imposed her own constraints upon the music. And this is just another way to visualize, and I'm using that in the larger sense, data, because we've been looking at squiggles all the time, and we're always trying to go, it's two-dimensional squiggles, maybe three-dimensional squiggles, but you applied music and temporal things to this, and you can just close your eyes and absorb the graph as opposed to staring at it.
Right. Like it's another way to experience the data in a way, like it's a good reminder that data doesn't actually exist, like we make it. like we take a certain context, and we take certain bits of empirical or sort of physical material things, and start creating a structure that allows the thing itself to tell us a little bit more about itself,
Yeah.
So like in like the modern age of like data science, like the idea that someone would be purchasing something as opposed to another, like that. I guess this kind of gets at like the weirdness of these computer algorithms kind of deciding what kind of things to present to us. That version that the algorithm has created is not us, right? But
Yep.
but
Right.
it's useful for in this case, I guess, selling ads, but
Yeah. But in the example of your music and taking this data, you also you have the algorithm that you wrote, and then that pops music out. But I always like to come back to the y-axis, or what I call the lie of the y-axis. Right now, people are using, news people are using the y-axis to lie about data, or imply data, or to impose their will upon you.
right.
At some point, you had to make a decision about amplitude and
Exactly.
assigning values, and
Yeah.
so you're in the music as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm like the algorithm putting on top of the squiggle. Like, okay, this is going to be the note A. This will be note C. It'll happen at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
It's like just this really science very often gets presented to us as this sort of dogmatic, we're discovering the facts of the universe, right? But, things like Einstein, even like things like Einstein's theory of relativity, or Newtonian physics, or calculus, like these are all created by humans. And we use these things to understand natural phenomenon. And it's not like it's not like we're discovering the hard facts, but we're creating a world that, like an abstract world that lets us interpret the material world.
Right. And when we prove a theory, we assert its dominance in the space of the thinkers, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not fact, because one day it could be disproven. In the
Right. Like we
example,
might learn
though,
something new, or
mhm,
encounter something that requires us to, like rethink that theory or
mhm,
rethink that framework. And, of course, that would require like very often that requires something pretty big, or like, because, like Newtonian physics worked for quite a while. And then
mhm,
Einstein came along and was like, well, general relativity, and it's like, wow, like this explains a whole bunch of stuff that before we couldn't even like not necessarily conceive of, but just kind of dismissed as
mhm.
possibilities, or that kind of thing. And in a field as young as neuroscience, it's even more sort of more of this like idea of like just encountering so many things that we have difficulty explaining. And so you got it. A huge part of science is trying to come up with a framework that many other people can use to try and answer some of these questions that we have, like, how does a neuron encode information, or like how do different kinds of neurons interact with each other to encode information, and certainly the answer could be right for one particular context, but not applicable in another. Yeah.
So Einstein is out there still affecting scientists that are being born today, and future
Mm-hmm.
scientists that are doing their postdoctoral work today in 2021. What does it feel like as you are, some number of years into your career? You're a young person, while Donald Hebb, who's long dead but also born in 1904, has a thing named after them. Do those kinds of little boxes, little silos, when someone has a theory and then names it, and now we're juxtaposing homeostatic plasticity and Hebbian plasticity, does the existence of a named theory hold you back in some way?
It Yeah, I think this kind of gets at like the like our kind of psychology of like placing labels and boxes on things, and how that almost brings us a sense of comfort.
Mm.
um, there's this I forget who said it, but there's this funny quote that I've heard, that science progresses on the graves of men. That it's the like when a person passes, that their idea goes with them and allows for new ideas to take its place. You could choose whether or not you want to be that grim about it, and maybe it's just a question about reframing the way we think about the ideas that we choose to give names to people, or give ideas names, that kind of thing.
Right.
And that we shouldn't be so attached to the idea of, Hebbian and homeostatic plasticity explicitly, like that, functioning as if those things are, like just are true in a sense,
unambiguously true simply because of their long-lasting effect on them.
Right.
Yeah. So, the feedback loops and things in neuroscience that were proven or proposed to be a theory, 25 years ago. Now it's 2021. Have there been things in the years that you've been doing this that have been disproven? Has there been any eureka moments where someone had said, "That's not how we thought it worked at all. We now have proof, and we're going to change the direction of neuroscience"?
I can't. I don't immediately have an example with sort of with like circuit neuroscience, but at least with like genetics, I think that recently has been a pretty big. There's been a revolution. I would say with the discovery of something like epigenetics, so the ability for not the genes to change, but rather the regulation of the genes by other mechanisms that can change how genes are expressed. And thus, like it's not the genetic code that's changing, it's how the genetic code is being used. And that's, there's the interesting story about how how when like Darwin and Lamarck in their early days arguing about how heritance worked, or how traits were heritable, that like maybe Lamarck was a little bit right, even though a giraffe stretching its neck doesn't necessarily means it gets passed on to the next generation. But there is an interesting ability for there exists a means for genes to be regulated in a particular way by the environment. And so whether or not we count that as inheritance is an interesting question. But I would say with the rise of epigenetics and the studying of gene regulation has been a pretty revolutionary aspect of biology. And a lot of this has applications to the brain because, neurons express genes. They're cells after all. And, things like neural activity can change gene expression. Like the whole transcription, the old biology dogma of DNA gets changed, gets coded into mRNA, gets coded into protein, that this is a dynamic process that's happening. It's not like just this one way, like you start and you develop and then you're done. It's that this process is ongoing. And the fact that neurons, like whether or not they've been active for a long time or if they've been quiet for a little bit, they'll change their genes in response to that. So like, what does that mean for neural function? Like, is this another way for a neuron to perhaps encode this idea of memory, or the new information or new activity paradigm that it's been exposed to?
And I'm thinking about my children now and how their brains are being changed, or at least we the layperson thinks that their brains are being changed by too much time on the iPad. Are we rewriting genes? Are we more myopic? Do we have more nearsightedness? Do we have more, more depression, more whatever? Are we in 100 years going to see the effects of too much screen time for the kids,
right,
expressed in our genes by starting with the way it's changing the plasticity of our brains
and
today?
It's not like a mutation that encodes that change, but rather that there was this ability, there was the space within the genetic code to like be pushed toward one direction or the other, and that the exposure to the environment, the like constant, in this case, like constant screen time, like maybe that has like this kind of effect that can be I don't want to use the word ingrained because that it comes with like a lot of I guess baggage, but like it can be coded into the neurons and have lasting impacts that way. And it's not the classic we were looking at screens for a very long time, and then that has changed. Like someone had a mutation where that now gets passed on. There are more complicated ways that and different ways that traits can be passed on and expressed.
Yeah, passed on culturally, passed on through oral mechanism. Yeah, all these different things. I mean, I think about how I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and we were told really positive things. You're great. You're smart. You're a unique snowflake. You're special. And that was different than how my parents grew up in the 40s and 50s, where it's like, you're not working hard enough. Da, 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 da. Does scrolling through Instagram make the next generation sadder or more depressed? Is that cultural? Is that in our genes? Is that in our neurons?
Maybe the answer is probably a combination of all those things.
Exactly.
And the interesting part comes in when trying to decipher the explicit mechanisms for that. It's like we know that it happens. It's like genes and environments and development all influence it. But I think the interesting question that can be answered there is exactly how does that happen? Is there a particular set of DNA that gets regulated in a certain way that leads to a change in the neurons and their function in a particular area of the brain that makes them more susceptible to expressing things like depression or anxiety, that kind of thing? And of course, these are incredibly difficult questions to answer. So, it'll take a lot of work in scientists and engineers working together and technologists to figure these things out. But
Well, I appreciate that you're out there doing the hard work for us, so we can learn from you.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to share it.
I appreciate that. So we've been chatting with Dr. Simón Sun. You can check out her website at simonsun.com and her music on Spotify, as well as the music section on simonsun.com. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.